Hey everyone, welcome back and a warm welcome to new viewers. Smash that like button, subscribe, and let's dive right in. Section 1, the paper trail, receipts that redefined a nation. History isn't just a story, it's a paper trail. It's a collection of receipts, documents signed, deals made, promises put to paper. For Japan, the modern era began with a series of such receipts, each one a turning point that would reshape its destiny and its role in the world. It began with the Cairo Declaration in 1943. Then came the Potsdam Declaration in 1945. These documents were architects of a new reality, a foundation to rebuild from the ashes of total war. The next receipt arrived in a different context. The San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951 officially ended the Allied occupation and restored Japan's sovereignty. But this freedom came with a price. On the very same day, Japan signed the first U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. This document bound Tokyo to Washington in a military alliance. Japan would host U.S. military bases. In return, the United States would guarantee its defense. This was the deal. Price, pragmatic for a disarmed nation in the Cold War. But the paper trail doesn't end there. By 1972, another player emerged, the People's Republic of China. Japan normalized relations with Beijing. The Japan-China Joint Communique opened a new chapter of economic opportunity and diplomatic engagement. Suddenly, Japan was not just an American ally, it was also a key economic partner to America's greatest ideological rival. This created a new, complex dynamic. Security alliance with the United States, commercial ties with China. These documents form the official narrative of post-war Japan. They tell a story of defeat, reconstruction, and alliance. They show a nation that surrendered its military ambitions for peace and prosperity under American protection. They also show a pragmatic country seizing the economic opportunities presented by a rising China. This is the history we can prove, the one written in treaties and communiques. But what if this paper trail, as clear as it seems, doesn't tell the whole story? What if there is a hidden layer, a quiet game being played in the shadows, just beyond the edges of these official documents? This is where our investigation truly begins. The official story, a loyal U.S. ally. Japan, the cornerstone of American strategy in Asia, a democratic partner with a shared regional vision, and yet, for decades, one of China's most important economic partners, helping to fuel the engine of a rising competitor, which raises a provocative question. Has Japan been playing a different game all along? Has Tokyo been quietly balancing ties with Washington and with Beijing, extracting benefits from each? We call this the double-dipping theory. The name is casual, the idea is serious. It suggests Japan publicly kept the U.S. alliance while privately pursuing policies that also favored China. Not betrayal or espionage, something subtler. Long-term national self-interest to maximize autonomy and economic gain. Tokyo learned to speak two languages, security with Washington and commerce with Beijing. This is speculative. There is no single smoking gun document, not a conspiracy, a framework to re-examine the historical record. Look at the gaps between statements and outcomes. Ask why a staunch U.S. ally would be so economically intertwined with China. Ask why some diplomatic moves seem to help both Beijing and Washington. The theory says these were calculated moves, a long game for influence and survival. It forces us to rethink the U.S.-Japan alliance. Japan as a shrewd, independent actor with a quiet agenda. The U.S. saw a fixed asset, a stationary aircraft carrier. Japan may have seen itself as nimble, navigating currents between two superpowers. Over this documentary, we'll dive into the evidence, separating fact from inference, to test this hidden history and its implications for Asia. In any serious investigation, you have to establish the rules. You have to draw a hard line between what is confirmed and what is merely suspected. Our rule is simple. We will always label our evidence. Throughout this journey, we will make it crystal clear when we are dealing with hard receipts, verifiable facts backed by documents, treaties, and official records, and when we are stepping into the realm of speculation to explore the double-dipping theory. This transparency is our promise to you. We are not here to sell you a conclusion. We are here to walk you through the evidence and let you weigh it for yourself, just as historians and intelligence analysts do. So what do we know for a fact? We know that Japan was occupied and fundamentally reshaped by the United States after World War II. We have the receipts, the San Francisco Treaty, Security Treaty 1951, Security Treaty 1960, which form the bedrock of the U.S. and Japan alliance. We know that U.S. bases remain in Japan to this day. We also have the receipts for Japan's deep economic relationship with China, the 1972 Normalization Agreement, decades of trade data showing massive investment and commerce. Finally, we have Japan Japan's own 2022 National Security Strategy, a document that explicitly names China as its greatest strategic challenge. These are the confirmed facts. What we suspect the core of the double-dipping theory is the hidden logic connecting these facts. The theory is an interpretation, an attempt to explain the why behind Japan's actions. It speculates that Tokyo's deep economic engagement with China wasn't just about business, it was a strategic hedge. It suggests that Japan's occasional diplomatic friction with the US wasn't just a disagreement among friends, but a calculated move to signal a degree of independence. This part of our story is built on analyzing patterns, connecting dots, and asking what if. It lives in the space between the lines of official documents and public statements. Our mission is to explore this space responsibly. We will present the official history as it is recorded. Then we will layer on the speculative questions raised by the double-dipping theory. We will examine key moments in post-war history through this dual lens, showing you both the conventional interpretation and the alternative, more clandestine one. By separating the receipts from the theory, we can have an honest conversation about the complexities of Japan's foreign policy. This isn't just an academic exercise. Understanding whether Japan has been a loyal partner, a quiet rival, or something in between is critical to understanding the power balance in Asia today. The year is 1945. Japan is a nation in ruins. Its cities are flattened, its economy has evaporated, and its people are on the brink of starvation. The unconditional surrender announced by Emperor Hirohito was not just a military defeat, it was the collapse of an entire world order that had guided Japan for decades. Into this vacuum stepped the Allied powers, led overwhelmingly by the United States. General Douglas MacArthur, as the supreme commander for the Allied powers, became the de facto ruler of Japan. The American occupation was a monumental undertaking aimed at nothing less than the complete transformation of a society from its political institutions to its very cultural fabric. The goal was twofold: demilitarization and democratization. The first order of business was to dismantle the machinery of war. Imperial Japanese Army, Navy, weapons factories were shut down and military leaders were put on trial for war crimes. But MacArthur's vision went far beyond mere punishment. He and his team of New Deal-era reformers saw a chance to build a new Japan from the ground up, one modeled on American democratic ideals. They introduced sweeping reforms touching every aspect of life: land ownership, labor rights, education, and the role of women in society. At the heart of this transformation was a new constitution. Drafted by American officials in a matter of weeks, it was a revolutionary document that fundamentally altered the source of power in Japan. Sovereignty was transferred from the emperor, who was demoted to a mere symbol of the state, to the people, guaranteed fundamental human rights, established a parliamentary system of government, and created an independent judiciary. It was a top-down revolution, an extraordinary experiment in social engineering imposed by a foreign power. For the Japanese people, exhausted by war and disillusioned with their former leaders, these changes offered a fragile glimmer of hope for a different, more peaceful future. While the initial focus was on punishing a former enemy, the geopolitical landscape was shifting rapidly. The specter of Soviet communism was beginning to loom large over East Asia, and American planners started to see Japan not just as a defeated foe to be managed, but as a potential asset in a new global struggle. This fear triggered what became known as the reverse course. The priorities of the occupation began to change dramatically. The focus shifted from reform to punishment, to economic recovery and political stability. The initial purges of wartime industrialists and politicians were quietly halted. In some cases, they were reversed. Men once targeted as part of Japan's militarist regime were now seen as experienced administrators. They were needed to rebuild the economy and fight communist influence from within. The American mission was no longer about dismantling the old Japan. It was about building a new, reliable partner. Japan was to be transformed from a former enemy into a key ally, a democratic bulwark, a capitalist bulwark against the spread of communism in Asia. Washington actively began to support Reconstruction with aid, technology, and access to the vast American market. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 supercharged this process. Japan became the primary staging ground and supply depot for United Nations forces in Korea. American military procurement orders, special procurements, flooded the Japanese economy. Factories that once produced planes, tanks, were now churning out trucks, uniforms, supplies for the American war effort. This kick-started an economic miracle that would define the coming decades. This great reversal set the fundamental terms of Japan's post-war identity, a nation dedicated to economic growth but politically and militarily subordinate to the United States. Japan's prosperity and national security became inextricably linked to Washington. The foundation for the U.S.-Japan alliance was laid, a pragmatic arrangement born from the ashes of war, a deal for survival that would shape Japan's choices for generations to come. At the very core of Japan's post-war identity is a single, extraordinary paragraph in its constitution. Article 9. This clause, insisted upon by the American occupiers, is one of the most radical statements of pacifism ever enshrined in a national legal document. It contains two simple but powerful commitments. First, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. Second, to accomplish this aim, land forces will never be maintained. Sea forces will never be maintained. Air forces will never be maintained. Other war potential will never be maintained. In essence, Japan legally swore off war and the means to wage it forever. This was the ultimate receipt for Japan's past aggression. It was a clear and unambiguous promise. For many Japanese citizens, this peace constitution was not an imposition but a liberation. Pacifism became a central tenet of the new national identity. But almost immediately, this noble ideal collided with the harsh realities of the Cold War. As Washington's strategy shifted during the reverse course, the absolute pacifism of Article 9 became a strategic inconvenience. American planners, now eager to build Japan into an anti-communist bastion, began pressuring Tokyo to rearm. This put Japanese leaders in an impossible position. How could they rearm without violating the very constitution that America itself had written for them? The solution was a masterpiece of legal and political interpretation. Instead of a formal army, Japan created a National Police Reserve in 1950, which later evolved into the Self-Defense Forces, SDF. The official line was that these forces were not war potential in the sense forbidden by Article 9. They were for purely defensive purposes. This interpretation allowed Japan to walk a fine line, satisfying American demands for rearmament while maintaining the public appearance of adhering to its pacifist constitution. By 1951, 7 years of American occupation were coming to an end. Representatives from 48 nations gathered to sign the Treaty of San Francisco. The formal peace treaty would officially end the war. However, this sovereignty came with a very important condition. On the very same day, Yoshida and Atchison signed a separate bilateral agreement, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. This created the San Francisco System. The system outsourced Japan's defense to the United States. In return, Japan acted as the Spear's forward base. The islands of Japan, particularly Okinawa, became a critical network. U.S. airfields, naval ports, command centers, a permanent, unsinkable aircraft carrier off the Asian mainland. America handles security, Japan handles the economy, but it also locked Japan into a deeply asymmetrical relationship. Its foreign and security policies would be tied to priorities decided thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C. Section 5. A nation divided. The internal struggle over security. The San Francisco system was far from universally accepted by the Japanese public. Leftist parties, student groups, labor unions, they saw the treaty as a mechanism that would entangle Japan in America's Cold War conflicts. The opposition was not just about abstract principles. It was about the tangible presence of American bases. Noise pollution, environmental damage, crimes committed by service members. The bases were a constant physical reminder that their nation's sovereignty was not absolute. This resentment fueled a powerful and persistent anti-base movement, particularly in Okinawa. This simmering conflict exploded in 1960 when Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi sought to revise and renew the security treaty. The result was the largest mass protest movement in Japanese history. The political turmoil was so intense that a planned visit by U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had to be canceled. Ultimately, Kishi's government forced the new treaty through, but the political cost was enormous. He was forced to resign shortly after. The 1960 crisis left deep scars. It demonstrated the profound public ambivalence toward the U.S. alliance. This internal division would force future Japanese leaders to perform a delicate balancing act. Out of the turmoil, a clear and coherent grand strategy for Japan began to emerge. It became known as the Yoshida Doctrine. The core tenets of the Yoshida Doctrine were simple and powerful. First, Japan's primary national goal would be economic development. Second, Japan would maintain a low-profile foreign policy. Third, Japan would rely on the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty for its national defense. While it would maintain the minimum necessary self-defense forces, it would resist pressure for significant rearmament. This light armament policy would free up vast amounts of capital that could be invested back into the economy. For decades, the Yoshida Doctrine was stunningly successful. It allowed Japan to rise from the ashes of war to become the world's second largest economy by the 1980s. It was the ultimate strategy of a quiet power. However, this doctrine also laid the groundwork for the complexities to come. By prioritizing economics above all else, Japan developed a unique strategic culture. It learned to separate its economic interests from its security alignment. This skill would become incredibly important when a new economic giant, China, began to rise right next door. The year is 1971. The Yoshida Doctrine is at its peak. For over 2 decades, Tokyo had dutifully aligned itself with the American position on China. It recognized the nationalist government in Taiwan. It had no official diplomatic relations with Mao Zedong's communist regime. That trust was about to be shattered. On July 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on national television and dropped a bombshell. He announced that he would be visiting the People's Republic of China the following year. The news hit Tokyo like a political earthquake. The Americans, without any prior warning or consultation, were making a secret radical pivot to Beijing. This was the Nixon shock. For Japanese policymakers, it was a moment of profound humiliation. The shock was not just about diplomatic protocol, it was a fundamental betrayal. If Washington could unilaterally reverse its long-held China policy without even a courtesy call, what other promises could be broken? The event exposed the deep asymmetry of the alliance. Japan was not an equal partner. The Nixon shock served as a brutal lesson. Blindly following the United States was a risky strategy. It created a political opening for a new generation of leaders who believed Japan must forge its own path. The first, most obvious move was to fix the diplomatic mess Washington had just created, and to beat the Americans to the punch. The political fallout was swift, paving the way for a new leader, Kakue Tanaka. Tanaka was a different breed of politician. Bold, decisive action. In September 1972, 2 months after becoming prime minister, Tanaka made his move. He flew to Beijing, the first Japanese prime minister to set foot in the PRC. He came to meet Chairman Mao Zedong. He came to meet Premier Zhou Enlai. The world watched fascinated. Tanaka was not just following Nixon, he was racing ahead to secure a deal. On September 29, 1972, Japan and the People's Republic of China signed the Japan-China Joint Communique. This was the new receipt. However, the genius of the communique was in what it didn't say. On the highly sensitive issue of Taiwan's political status, Japan used diplomatic ambiguity. The document states that Japan fully understands and respects China's position. It did not explicitly recognize this claim. Another critical element was Japan's expression of remorse for the war. In return, the Chinese side announced it would renounce its demand for war reparations from Japan. This was a monumental concession from Beijing. This act laid the second pillar of Japan's post-war grand strategy. It now had its security alliance with the United States and a burgeoning economic partnership with China. The quiet game of balancing the two had officially begun. The 1972 normalization was like opening a floodgate. The political agreement immediately unlocked decades of pent-up economic energy. After 1972, it exploded. Two-way trade doubled and then tripled in short order. This was not just a one-way street. Japan began providing China with enormous development loans, technology transfers, and industrial plants. This policy was known as Seikei Bunri, the separation of politics and economics. While the United States often viewed China through the lens of ideology, Japan saw it primarily through the lens of economic opportunity. While American politicians debated how to contain communism, Japanese engineers and executives were in China, building steel mills and signing billion-dollar contracts. They were constructing bridges of commerce and industry. This trade explosion had profound consequences. It fueled China's economic modernization, providing the capital and technology that helped kickstart Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up era. But it also created a deep and lasting economic dependency. As the years went by, the health of many of Japan's largest corporations became inextricably linked to the health of the Chinese market. This economic reality would give Beijing significant leverage over Tokyo, creating a complex dynamic where Japan's commercial interests would sometimes clash with the security imperatives of its alliance with the United States. The story of Japan's relationship with China after 1972 is, above all, a business story. It was not diplomats, but the titans of Japanese industry, Nippon Steel, Panasonic, Toyota. They possessed the technology, the capital, and the manufacturing expertise that China desperately needed. In return, China offered an almost limitless supply of labor, vast natural resources, and a colossal consumer market on the horizon. The initial wave of engagement focused on heavy industry. Japanese firms helped build massive projects like the Baoshan Steel Complex. The famous Japanese Keiretsu often moved in concert. As China's economy opened up further, the second wave of Japanese investment began, focused on consumer goods. Japanese brands became household names in China. Panasonic televisions, Toyota cars, Sony Walkmans. This deep economic entanglement created a powerful pro-China lobby within Japan. The Japanese Business Federation, the Keidanren, became one of the most consistent and influential voices advocating for stable and friendly relations with Beijing. Whenever political tensions flared up, it was often the leaders of corporate Japan who would work behind the scenes to calm the waters. Their message was simple: do not let politics get in the way of business. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, sent shockwaves across the globe, but for Japan, it was a source of profound anxiety. The Yoshida Doctrine was built around the central threat of Soviet communism. With the Soviet Union gone, a troubling question echoed in Tokyo: what was the alliance for now? This period was known as the post-Cold War drift. Some in Japan argued for a more independent foreign policy. The Security Alliance, once an essential shield, was now seen by some as a liability. Voices in the US started Japan bashing. Tokyo was accused of being a free rider, getting a free pass on defense. While its corporations hollowed out American industry, the alliance seemed to be losing strategic rationale. If the alliance was to survive, it needed a new purpose. The result was the 1996 US-Japan Joint Declaration on Security. It expanded the alliance beyond the direct defense of Japan. Japan shifted from passive host to active supporter. U.S. forces and Japan's self-defense forces ramped up joint exercises, building interoperability unseen during the Cold War. The American shield and Japanese spear became more integrated. While Japan and the United States were busy redefining their alliance, the ground was shifting beneath their feet. China wasn't just growing, it was exploding. Its economy doubled and then doubled again. This incredible economic rise was directly fueling a comprehensive military modernization program. Beijing invested heavily in new technologies and, most significantly, a blue water navy capable of projecting power far beyond its own coastline. For the first time in centuries, China was becoming a major maritime power. For Japan, this development was deeply alarming. It was a next-door neighbor. The growth of Chinese military power was not an abstract threat, it was a tangible reality. The comfortable assumption of the Yoshida Doctrine was starting to look dangerously obsolete. This dual reality placed Japanese policymakers in an incredibly difficult position. How could they manage a relationship with a country that was simultaneously essential to their economic prosperity and the primary source of their security concerns? Nothing crystallized the new security challenge from China more than a small uninhabited chain of islands in the East China Sea. In Japan, they are known as the Senkaku Islands. In China, they are called the Diaoyu Islands. That delicate balance shattered in the 2010s. In 2010, a Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels. Beijing cut off exports of critical rare earth minerals. In 2012, Tokyo purchased 3 of the islands. Beijing saw it as an attempt to change the status quo. China began sending government vessels to patrol. The front lines became tense and dangerous. This gray zone warfare, pressure just below armed conflict, became the new normal. The Senkaku crisis was a brutal wake-up call for Japan. The crisis transformed Japan's security debate. Tokyo accelerated a shift from a passive post-war posture to a more robust defense strategy. The escalating tensions brought a new and powerful figure to the forefront: Shinzo Abe. returned to power in late 2012 with a bold and transformative vision. Abe's answer to this challenge was a new strategic concept he called proactive pacifism. Abe's government began a steady, significant increase in Japan's defense budget. He pushed for the acquisition of new military capabilities, all designed to better defend Japan's remote islands. The centerpiece of the Abe Revolution was a controversial package of security legislation. These new laws reinterpreted the Constitution to allow for the exercise of collective self-defense. Abe's policies were deeply controversial at home, but Abe pressed forward. He strengthened the U.S. alliance, built new security partnerships with countries like Australia, built new security partnerships with countries like India, and laid the institutional groundwork for a more muscular and assertive Japan. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in early 2022 shattered it completely. The parallel was immediate and terrifying. What was to stop China from doing the same to Taiwan? In December 2022, Prime Minister Kishida's government released Japan's new national security strategy. It names China as the greatest strategic challenge Japan has ever faced, the most revolutionary element, acquiring counter-strike capabilities. To deter attack, Japan must have the credible ability to strike back at the source. The NSS calls for doubling defense spending. The money will buy hundreds of long-range cruise missiles. The 2022 NSS is, in effect, the final death certificate for the Yoshida Doctrine. But the dilemma remains. Japan's greatest strategic challenge is also one of its most vital economic partners. Section 1, Beyond the Receipts. Entering the realm of theory, we have walked through the official history, but now we step beyond the edge of the paper trail. This is where we lay out the speculative thesis at the heart of our investigation, the double-dipping theory. It asks a provocative question: what if the official story is incomplete? The theory posits that behind the public facade of a loyal U.S. ally, Tokyo has consistently and quietly pursued a parallel strategy of engagement and accommodation with Beijing to skillfully play both sides to maximize Japan's own national interest, a sophisticated two-track foreign policy. One track was public, loud, and focused on the security alliance. The other track was private, quiet, and focused on economic and political engagement with China. The first and most powerful piece of circumstantial evidence lies in economics. It was Japanese government loans and development assistance that paved the way. A plausible interpretation is that the Japanese state was making a strategic long-term investment. Key example: Japan's response to Tiananmen Square in 1989. The United States and European nations imposed harsh, lasting sanctions. Japan's response was noticeably more muted. Japan was first among major industrialized nations to resume engagement. A more speculative aspect revolves around the flow of technology. By becoming the indispensable supplier of critical technologies, Japan gained a subtle form of leverage. The final element is the mastery of the unofficial channel. This track to diplomacy is common globally, but in Japan it's a high art. It allows Japan to maintain two separate conversations simultaneously. Our investigation began with a paper trail. On top of this factual foundation, we layered a speculative framework. We rigorously separate confirmed from inferred. The theory explains why a loyal U.S. ally could become the chief economic enabler of its primary competitor. The theory suggests these weren't contradictions, but calculated moves of a master of the quiet game. Whether you accept the theory, this dual lens reveals a more complex Japan. A nation in a permanent strategic bind, navigating treacherous currents between its security guarantor and indispensable economic partner. Section 2, The Tightrope Today. This brings us to the present moment, where the tightrope Japan has walked for 50 years is stretched to its breaking point. Washington is demanding its allies pick a side. Meanwhile, Beijing is using its economic leverage more aggressively. The quiet game of balancing is becoming a loud game of choices. The space for ambiguity is rapidly shrinking. Yet, even as Japan buys American Tomahawk missiles, its largest corporations remain profoundly invested in the Chinese market. The economic umbilical cord has not been cut. This raises the ultimate question: can Japan truly align itself militarily with the U.S. against China while remaining so deeply dependent on China for its economic prosperity? Has Japan's long history of balancing created a path dependency that is now impossible to escape? Has it become so adept at speaking two strategic languages that it is no longer capable of speaking with one clear voice? The final chapter of this story is yet to be written. receipts, rivalries, commerce, security is no longer a theoretical exercise for historians. It is the central, urgent reality facing a world on the brink of a new kind of conflict. If you like this, why not like, subscribe, and share for more? How Japan navigates this perilous moment will have consequences that ripple across the globe. The hidden history of Japan's quiet rivalry may just be the prologue to a much larger and louder story.